Okay, here I am finally for one of those videos, those topic-oriented videos that I've been talking about. Today we're going to be looking at the three worlds. Let me just say that I am probably the most high-tech, low-tech guy you've ever met, or maybe low-tech, high-tech. I'm not sure how to say that. What I mean is, I can do stuff like get online and use Moodle and use different online technologies and whatnot, and yet I still have to draw stuff. I think I rendered this like one time when I was at a coffee shop and I had a napkin or something like that, and you know, wrote it out and took a picture of it, uploaded it on my computer, and I've been using this, like projecting on a whiteboard in class, as well as right now I'm holding this up right here for you all. This is a representation of the three worlds. That's the topic today. Did I say that before? Okay, so anyways, the three worlds. And so what you see right here is the author, and this author wrote this text, and this author is writing this text about Jesus, who is the Son of God. And this author writing this text about this Jesus who lives in time and space, the historical Jesus, is creating a literary representation of Jesus. See the little Jesus right there? Of this historical Jesus. And so the Jesus that you have here is actually a product of this author's literary craft representing this historical Jesus. And so when we're reading about Jesus in the Gospels, we want to use all the same tools that we would use when we're doing literary analysis to help us understand this Jesus, which is a representation of the historical figure Jesus. Jesus being a contemporary of the author who wrote the story about Jesus. Right? You're following this so far? And then because we are Christians and we want to be followers of Christ, we want to understand what this Jesus looks like if he was to live in our culture. And so this is supposed to be us in our time and in our place, imagining what Jesus would look like if he was in our circumstances and we're trying to follow him. So that would be the contemporary dimension of the text. So you have the literary dimension of the text, the historical dimension of the text. Here, the author and the historical Jesus, the literary dimension, Jesus as he's rendered in the Gospels, and the Jesus of our imagination in our contemporary culture that's intimately related to Jesus as we understand him through the Gospels, right? So let me kind of unpack some of these dynamics for you, beginning with the historical dimension of the text, all right? Like I said, this is high tech, low tech. I have my computer down here that I'm looking at to kind of remind me of some of the key ideas I want to hit upon when it comes to this. And me and technology, we have a kind of, I don't know, tense relationship. Anyways, okay. So we're talking about the historical world of the author. We're talking about the person who wrote a biblical text. In this case, the Gospels. The author is a person who lived in a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular culture. And these cultures had common assumptions about life and human nature, the nature of the divine, political institutions, political values, social values. There's also social norms and protocols and rituals by which collective life together was managed and governed. And all these things are in the background as an author is writing whatever text. And these things are in the background because they operate as assumptions, often things that the author will not explicitly identify, because the author will assume, writing to an audience that is roughly contemporaneous to himself, that that audience will understand these things, and so he won't have to explain them. But this does become a problem when people 2,000 years later in a different culture encounter that same text, and they don't have access to the same set of assumptions as the author lived in. And so that's why we need to plug into the historical dimension of the text. That means we want to do as much historical research as we can to understand the context of the text. We want to understand the historical Jesus as best as we can. We want to understand the author who wrote about Jesus as best as we can, because both the author and Jesus lived in the same culture with one another. They had a lot of shared values, all these assumptions that I was talking about earlier. And the more we understand about that world, the more we understand about the foundation of meaning upon which the text operates. And again, there is a lot that is implicit in the text, not explicit, implicit. In other words, it is not said directly, but it's in the background behind what the author is saying directly as a kind of foundation of meaning for what the author is directly saying. So, in order to do that kind of research, I myself rely upon historians who are looking at Palestinian ancient world, who are doing kind of like sociological research or archaeological research, and I'm relying upon their works to help me understand what that culture was like, so that when I'm reading about Jesus, I have this larger picture of the context in which he is operating, and that helps me uncover subtle dimensions of meaning that you may not pick up as you're reading the text by itself. There's a lot that you could read just in the text by itself as a story, but there's also other things that are going on that if you're not aware of this larger contextual background, that you won't pick up on it. Okay, so let me look at my notes once again. Thus, the meaning of the text is found both in explicit and implicit elements of communication. And again, the author is generally assuming that his audience shares a common background, so there's a lot of things he will not articulate or explain. He'll just assume his audience knows it. And as I said, this reality becomes an issue when we who live 2,000 years later encounter this text, and we carry a lot of baggage with us, a lot of assumptions with us, and we often read that text through our assumptions, and therefore we often come to wrong conclusions. Not necessarily profoundly wrong conclusions, although sometimes, but we do come to wrong conclusions because we live in a different culture, and that culture inculcates in us a different set of assumptions and beliefs and values about God, nature, human nature, how government should work, the rights of man, all that kind of stuff. And yet the ancients didn't have those assumptions, and all of that, again, is operating in the background. And so it's influencing our reading of the text. And so we just want to be aware of those cultural differences between who we are and who they are as we're reading about Jesus in the text. So that's the historical background. Now, let's get into the literary dimension of the text. Texts are comprised of words, as you all know. And these words actually create a world in our imagination. So I think of C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Chronicles of Narnia. I think of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, and that whole universe that's created with Hogwarts and wizardry and witchcraft and all that kind of stuff. And, in the fictional accounts, like we see in Lord of the Rings, those are not real people, but they certainly seem real to us. They take on a life unto themselves in our imagination because the author provides all these details about this world they live in, the things that these people do, the characters do, what they say, that they become like real, incredible people in our imaginations. So likewise, when these authors are writing about the historical Jesus, they are creating a literary construction of this Jesus in the Gospels. Now, this is not to say, hear me, hear me, hear me. This is not to say that that is a fictional Jesus. I believe that is a credible account of the historical Jesus that we are getting in the Gospels. But those accounts that we are getting in the Gospels are told with a very particular purpose in mind. So there is some literary craft that those authors are using to create this particular portrait of Jesus for a particular purpose. I believe I mentioned that to you in an earlier email when I was talking about, for example, in Matthew, how Matthew wants to present Jesus as the King of Israel, David's greater son, because he's particularly writing to a Jewish audience. And so he begins his gospel with this genealogy that goes back to Abraham, Abraham being the father of the Jews. By comparison or contrast, when you look at Luke's gospel, he's writing primarily to a Gentile audience, and so he has a different purpose, a different impression or portrait that he wants to leave about Jesus for that audience. And when he starts his genealogy, when he starts his gospel, he has a genealogy where he traces Jesus' lineage back through Abraham all the way to Adam, the father of us all, thus presenting Jesus as the new Adam, the perfect man who came to serve humanity. And so the kind of details that these authors in the Gospels are providing about Jesus are shaped and provided and structured through this literary craft that authors who write fiction use to create characters. So we're talking about characterization, we're talking about setting, we're talking about plot outline, we're talking about where one story is located in the larger story of the Gospels, how the whole Gospel is structured thematically. All those kinds of things are what I mean when I'm talking about literary craft. And so we want to analyze that aspect of the gospel because that's part of uncovering the message that the author is trying to communicate to us when he's rendering this portrait of Jesus. So that's basically the literary dimension of the text. Pardon me, I'm over here once again looking at my notes. Now we talk about the timeless dimension of the text. That is how the text speaks to us today, guides us today, informs our life today. The idea behind this is that certain texts possess timeless qualities. So not just the Bible, for example. I mean, like one of the things that comes to mind right now, I was a intellectual history major as an undergrad, which means I studied a wide variety of texts in the field of the humanities primarily. And so one of the persons I read was William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's plays continue to speak to us in this day and age, even though it was written 500 years ago, because Shakespeare shed light on the human condition. Well, likewise, we see that in the Bible. But the Bible also has something else going on, insofar as Christians believe that the Bible is the Word of God, that God is the author of humanity, and God understands how humanity is to best live in order to flourish and be under his blessing. And so even though the Bible is an ancient text, there is this component where the Bible still authoritatively speaks to us to this day and can guide us to this day. But we have to read it rightly in order to understand how that authority is operating in our life, in order to enter into the blessing that God has for us. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things you want to be aware of is that when we are reading the Bible, we are coming to the Bible with our own cultural baggage. We have these set of assumptions and values and beliefs that we carry that we're not always aware of them. It's operating in our consciousness somewhere, sometimes in the background, sometimes in the foreground, but it's always there, and it functions as a kind of lens between us and the text that we're reading, and it influences how we read the text. So just being aware of that fact is a big deal. It's one of the things we want you to be aware of in order to become a more effective reader of scriptures. So that when you experience a kind of cultural confrontation between the culture of the Bible and ourselves, we don't automatically assume we have it right and they have it wrong. Maybe they need to speak to us. Maybe we need to bring our lives into conformity to what we are seeing there. Conversely, there might be other instances where the message of the Bible is so culturally bound, we have to learn how to translate the message as it is there and bring it into our culture here, because the Bible, I believe, was designed by God to be culturally responsive. So there's this hermeneutical task, this task of application or translation. I'm picking up some of the language from Gordon Fee right now. But it begins with being aware of the set of assumptions that we have versus the set of assumptions that the people of the ancient world have. Let me see, what else do I want to say about this? I just became aware I say a lot. I need to cut back on that. Well, let me just take you now to the Gordon Fee text. I'm at 13 minutes. I want to go 2 more minutes, make this no more than 15. When you look at Gordon Fee, he's touching upon the same things, even though he doesn't quite use this language. I don't think Fee uses the language of historical world, literary world, contemporary world. Instead, he'll talk about the act of exegesis and the act of application. And in exegesis, that's where he's going to talk about context. I believe, if I remember correctly, it's been a while, honestly, since I read these texts. I should probably review them. But he talks about them in terms of literary context and historical context. That if we want to understand the text, we have to understand what the author was saying to the original audience. And in order to understand what the text is saying to the original audience, we have to understand the historical background of that original audience. And we have to understand the genre in which the author is writing. And we have to understand the larger literary context in which any smaller unit of scripture that we're looking at is found within. And so all those things are the things that we want to be aware of when we're doing the process of exegesis, trying to get at the original meaning of the text, pardon me. And then we go into the act of application. Now, how does the text, since we've uncovered the original meaning as best as we can, speak to us in this day and age? And one of the things he mentions, and I think I'm just going to finish off with this, is as we're trying to translate the meaning of the text from its original context to our context, we have to be aware of the fact that the Bible cannot say something to us that would contradict what it originally said to them. It cannot say something to us that would contradict what it originally said to them. It could perhaps say more. It could perhaps apply it in new and maybe even unexpected ways, yes. But as it is being applied or unfolding in this new context in which we live in, the way it unfolds cannot ultimately contradict the original meaning of the text. And so what we need is a bit of discernment, and we need community. This is not something I believe that people can do one-on-one, me encountering the book by myself, but we read together. I'm reminded of the fact that Paul talks about the Spirit distributes gifts. There are those who are called to be teachers. There are those who are called to be pastors. There are those who are called to be leaders in the church. We are all part of a body, and the text is meant to function within that body. And so we have to honor those gifts in one another, so that together we could go into the depths of scriptures, the depths of the gospel, and uncover this grace that God has for us. So I hope that helps. I'm often afraid that when I give these lectures and I'm cranking it out as fast as I am, that I might be confusing you. I would say listen to this a couple of times, and then if you have any further questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I will do my best to respond. I get a lot of emails every day. I have this class and another class, as well as other things I'm involved in. If I don't respond soon, then send me another email. I'm not offended. I'm the kind of person that needs that sometimes. And I hope things are going well for you. Like I said, I'm trying to be as flexible as possible, and I hope you'll be flexible with me. We'll get through this together. And I have a couple of other videos coming at you shortly, probably tomorrow or the next day. All right? You have a good evening, or a good day, or a good morning, as the case may be. Bye-bye.